Hey guys, and welcome to another one of my tutorials. So in this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to set up a system that will allow you to push objects. And then like I do for all my tutorials, I want to quickly, before we start coding it, I want to show you how it's going to behave when we're finished and how you'll be able to work with it, because I think that's important. So just bear with me here. This will take a little bit of time, but I think it's really worth watching because, again, it will give you a good idea how the system works. So as we're coding it, it will make a lot more sense to you. So just to kind of show you how it works. So I have this platform here, right? So it's too high for me to jump up on by myself. But if I come over here and I press my push button, I'll start pushing this little crate. And you can see when you're pushing it, you can look around and then you can push the button again to stop. And then of course now I can jump up on my little platform. And so this box, I have it set up so you can push it left or right. So I can also push it back in this direction. Um, but if I try to push it forward, for example, it won't let me. Or if I try to push it backwards, it also won't let me. And that's totally configurable with this system. So let me just step out real quick and show you what I mean by that. So this is a pushable actor. So when I select it, it has these push transforms. And these push transforms are just transforms that you can set up over here on the left. So you can see I've added two of them. I've added the one on the left here and the one on the right. And so the position of the transform and then this arrow indicates where the player will stand and which direction he'll push it in. So, for example, if I wanted to be able to push it away from me, all I would have to do is add another push transform by pressing this button here. You can see it adds a new push transform, and then I can just select that push transform and then move it like I'd move any object. And I'm going to set it to 150 since that's what works well for this object. And so this is saying, okay, the player is going to stand here, but you can see the red arrow is facing the wrong way. We want it to be facing the way he's going to push it in. So we can just take it and rotate it 180 degrees. And now it's saying, okay, he's going to stand here where this little blue circle looking thing is, and he's going to push it that way. And now if I run it and I come over here and I push it from this side, it will work. And likewise, if I were to just delete all the push transforms and I press play, I would now not be able to push it in any direction. So it's that easy to add different push directions to your objects, because I know you guys are probably going to ask me, what if I only want to be able to push it one way, or what if I want to be able to push it multiple ways? Well, I wrote this system so that you can kind of configure objects to be pushed however you want. And then the last thing I want to cover is these little things over here. So these are all the different checks that we're doing, because I tried to make this as robust as possible. It's not like a totally robust system. Like you're not going to be able to push things over like really weird landscapes and stuff like that. But I think for the most part, when people are adding pushing things to their game, it's on flat surfaces. So I've done my best to make it as robust as possible for those use cases. So for example, it won't let you push things through walls. So if I come back here and I try to push it, it starts to do it, but then it aborts because it realizes I'm going through a wall. If there's not enough space for me to push it, like in this case, there's not enough space for my character to get into that animation, then it also won't let you do it. If there's a floor behind you, but it's too steep to walk on, so if I do this and I try to push it, it won't let me because it sees, okay, there's a floor there, but it's too steep. And if there is a floor, but it's not too steep, then it'll actually let you do it. And one thing you'll notice about these objects is if you look at where my hands are, so they're actually, pretty close to being in the exact right spot, right? So his hands are above his head, but if I go and I push this object, oh, I removed the things. Let me add one back real quick, because I actually have it set up so the hands go to the correct spots on the object. So let me just move this over here, set it back to 150, and then just rotate it like so. So you notice I push this object, his hands are down towards the top of the crate. And that's all dynamic based off the height of the object. You'll even notice when my guy's going downhill, his hands will start lower and they'll move up, as you can see. All right, so that I think covers pretty much everything about how the system works. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the actual coding of it. So like always, we are going to be doing this from scratch. Oh, let me close my other project, because that has nothing to do with this tutorial. Don't freak out. We're not going to be doing C++. This is just a different project. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up a new project. So open up the Epic Game Launcher. And then I'm going to be using 4.26.0. So launch that. And then while we're waiting, I should mention, so in the link of this video, or actually we'll come back to that later. So go ahead and select games and then hit next. And then We'll be doing this in the third person project. So select third person template and hit next. And then we don't need any starter content. Well, actually, let's do add some starter content so that we can have boxes to push around. So we'll say with starter content, and we'll call this pushing tutorial, and then go ahead and create the project. Okay, so yeah, so one thing I will mention, these crates that you see and like the scaffolding thing on the left there, that's just from a content pack that I have. You don't need it to follow this tutorial. We're not going to be really using it. I just kind of had them in as examples. You can use any static meshes you want, but if you're interested, I think it's called, yeah, it's Industrial Props Pack 6 is the one I used. You can see it has my little crate and stuff in there. So if you are curious, that's what it's used. And for the animation, it will be in the description of this video. There'll be a link to it. So go ahead and download that now. It should look something like this. You can see we have a push high FBX and a push low FBX. And like I said, these are the animations that we need. So first of all, let's just import these. So go ahead and download that file and unzip it. And then let's go to our content folder. And then I think it's in mannequins, animations. Yeah, let's just go ahead and add them here. So we want to take these two FBX files and just drag them in to the animations folder. And then when this pops up, we want to select the UE4 mannequin skeleton and then say import all. So these animations are just some animations I got off Mixamo, and then I retargeted them to match the mannequin skeleton. So if you just drag these in real quick, you can kind of see what they do. So push low is him pushing in with his hands low, and push high is pushing with his hands high. So they kind of just look like this. And then what we're going to do is eventually we're going to blend these together so that his hands will be in the correct spot based on how high the object is. So we can just go ahead and delete these right now. Okay, so we have everything that we need now to get started. So let's start creating some blueprints. So let's think here. So the first thing we need to create is the interact interface. And if you followed my tutorials before, then this is going to be very familiar. So we can right click and make a new folder, and we will call this the interact interface. And so what this will be for is this interface, basically anything in your game that you want to be able to interact with, whether it be a pushable object or a weapon on the ground that you want to pick up or a light switch that you want to be able to turn on and off, like whatever it is, you can set it up so that it just needs to implement this interface, and then whenever you interact with it, it will call an event inside of that object. So for a door, you could open it. For a crate, you can start pushing it. If this doesn't make sense, then hopefully it will when we get closer to the end, but this is a very common thing that I do to make the push or the interaction of things very standardized. So we can right click and we want to go to blueprints and we want to create a blueprint interface, and we will just call this the interact interface. I'm just going to hit this button over here. Don't freak out. This just opens up this little side panel just because I like to be able to see this. But anyway, so inside of here, we just want to add one new function. So up here at the top right, rename this function to on interacted. And then we want to add an input, and the input is going to be a third person character. So hit new parameter, change this to third person character, and we will call this the player, like so. So if you're not using the third person template, then this is just should be whatever player character you're using, basically. So yeah, that should look like that, and we can just compile and save. And you can see we're not actually filling out anything here. I don't want to go too much into detail what interfaces are, but basically we're just defining the function here. We're not actually filling it out here. We'll be filling it out inside of the pushable object. So this is all we need to do. Make sure you have this set up, and then you can just close this. Okay, so that's our interact interface. And the next thing we can do is start creating our pushable object. So actually no, let's let me think. Yeah, actually let's create our pushable object next. So let's go up here and then make a new folder, and we will call this pushable. And so inside of here, we will create our pushable object. So we can right click. We want to create a new blueprint class, and we want the parent class to be of type actor. And we will just call this BP underscore pushable. So this will be the base class for all of our pushable objects. So let's go ahead and open this up like so. Um, and the first thing we need to do is we need to implement that interactable interface so that way the character can interact with this object. So under class settings up here at the top, we want to add the interactable interface. And you can see when we do that, we'll get this on interacted function over here on the left. If you don't see this, then that probably means you're on a very old version of Unreal. And you can instead search for it by going to the event graph and searching for like on interacted, and it will show up here, and then you can just click on it and it will implement it for you. But that's only if you're in an older version. But if you're cool and on a newer version, then all you have to do is right click on this and say implement event. And when you do that, it will create this little node for you. And so the idea here is whenever you interact with anything, in this case, the pushable, then this event will get called. So for right now, let's just do a print string and we'll say interacted um, with pushable object, just for right now so we can see it's working. So now we need to set up the character or the player so that you can interact with it. So right now the viewport, we should actually probably add something to that real quick because right now it's empty. So we want to just add a static mesh to it so we can have something to push. So we'll add components, search for static mesh, or yeah, static mesh. And then by default, it adds it under the default scene root, but really we don't need the default scene root. So I'm just going to take this static mesh, drag it up on top, and replace it like so. And so now over here on the right, you can select whatever static mesh you want. So I'm just going to search for shape underscore cube. But again, you could put in here anything that you want to be pushable. It doesn't really matter what the static mesh is. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to use this shape cube thing. Okay, so now let's go back to our scene. And let's add this guy in like so. All right, so here is the thing we want to be able to push. And so what we want to be able to do is be able to walk up to it, and then when we're close enough to it, be able to press a button and then have it call this event on interacted. That's the first step. So to do that, we need to open up our third-person character. So I'm just going to say edit blueprint. And then down in the event graph tab, let's see, we got begin play. Okay, so let's add it down here below everything else. So we need to add a button for interacting. We can just do that in the project settings real quick. So go to your project settings, you do edit project settings like that. And then under input, action mappings, we want to add an interact button. So hit this little plus button and search for interact, or sorry, type interact for the name of it. And then you can either search for the key, or if you're on a newer version of Unreal, you can hit this little button here and just press the button. So I'm going to set it to F. So whenever we press F, you will interact with it. And now back here in our third person character, we can right click and say event interact. And that will pop up. So basically, whenever we press the F key, it will call this event. And so what we want to do here is we want to check which objects are near us. And we want to check if any of the objects that are near us implement the interact interface. And if they do, then we want to interact with that object. So to do that, we can use a handy little function called sphere overlap actors, like so. And one thing I want to do is also be able to draw this so you can visualize the sphere, just so you can see how big it is. So I'm actually going to take this and right click and say collapse to function. And that'll make us a new function. And then inside of this function, we'll do that, but we'll also draw the debug sphere so you can see what's going on. And so let's come over here on the left and rename this to sphere overlap actors as well. And then we want to make this private. So we can come over here to the right and say private, just so nobody else can access it. And then we can hit this little drop down here. It's kind of useful. Say show access specifiers. And you can see when I do this, it adds private in front of this. It doesn't actually change anything. It just changes how it's displayed, but it's a little useful because it lets you know quickly at a glance what's private and what's public. You don't have to do that. It's just something I like to have on. So we will hook this up to the pressed for right now. And then inside of here, you can see we have our function or our sphere overlap actors node that we added from before. But like I said, we also want to draw a debug sphere. So I'm going to unhook this And then I'm going to add a sequence node by holding down S and left clicking. You can also get this by just right clicking and searching for sequence. It'll show up. And so we want to do two things. We want to draw the debug sphere. So we're going to right click and say draw debug sphere. And then for the center and the radius, we're going to take those in as parameters. So I'm going to drag the center over here to add it to that. And I'm also going to do that for the radius, like so. And then I hate it when lines go through things, so I'm actually going to unhook these now and then drag off and say get center. And it does the same thing, it's just a lot cleaner because you don't have giant lines going everywhere. And so for the duration, we'll just bump this up to 2, and then the thickness, we'll set it to 1. Okay, so that's just going to draw it so we can visualize it because that's really helpful, I think. And then the next thing we'll do is actually the sphere overlap. So we'll just copy the center and radius and use the same ones here. Now, for the object types, we're going to have to drag off of this and say make array. And so this is basically telling it which object types we want this sphere overlap event to overlap with. So you want to make sure that the type of your pushable objects or any other type of objects in your game is included in this list that you want to be interactable. So in our case, if you go to BP pushable and you look on the static mesh and you search for collision and you hit this drop down here, you can see the type of this object is world dynamic. So we at least need to have world dynamic in this list. And again, if you plan to use this interaction interface for other things, then you want to make sure that if you have other things in your game, like maybe you want to be able to interact with pawns or vehicles, then they also need to be in this list. But since we're not doing that, I'm just going to add world dynamic for right now. And then finally, the actors to ignore. We obviously want to ignore ourselves, the player, because we don't care if we're always going to overlap with ourselves. So we'll just say make array, and then we will pass in ourselves. So we'll say get ref to self, like so. And then this is going to return to us all the actors we overlapped with. And so actually all we want to do is we want to just take this and drag it on to the start node again, and now we'll add a return node, like so. And we will just hook that up like so. All right, so again, just to recap, all it's doing is it's drawing a debug sphere, and then it's doing the actual sphere overlap actors, and then it's returning to us the actors that it overlapped it with. So now we can go back to our event graph here, and we just need to fill out these input parameters. So for the center, we could use the center of the actor, which would be our character's center, which would be like right here where this blue arrow is, like his origin. But it would be better if it was at his feet, so that way the sphere, like the radius of the sphere would go out right here as opposed to up here. So that way it hits more things more accurately. So let's do it at his feet location. So back here in the event graph, we can say get actor location. And then we want to get his feet location. So we want to subtract from this, like his half height. So we'll say vector minus vector. And then we want to split this because we only want to affect the z value, which is the up and down. And we want to subtract half of his height. And we can get that from the capsule component. So we can drag in the capsule component and say get scaled capsule half height, which again is just half of his height. And when we do that, that will get us his feet location, and we can hook that up to the center. And then for the radius, we'll come back in here and actually change this to something else later. But for right now, we can just hard code something. So we'll just put like 120. We'll fill this out with something different later, like I said, but just put something in here right now, like 120 or some range. And then if we play this, just to show you what's going on, we press play and I press F, you can see it creates a sphere of radius 120 around our feet. And so we want to just know whenever it overlaps with this box here. So we can take the things that it overlaps with, and we can do a for each loop. And we actually want to use for each loop with break because we want to break out of it early if we overlap with something that we can interact with. So we'll select this one. And then the thing we care about here is if the thing we overlapped with implements the interactable interface, right? Because if it doesn't, then we don't care because we can't interact with it. So we can drag off of this and say does implement interface. And this will return to us a Boolean for whether or not it does or doesn't. So we can drag off this and say branch. Oh, and make sure for the interface, you select the interact interface from here. And so if it does implement that interface, then we want to call on interacted. So to do that, I'm going to double click here, create a reroute node, because we need to drag off of this. And we want to say on interacted, which is that message that calls this function, right? So we're basically just calling this function. And hook that up to the true. And then as you can see here, this is expecting us to pass in the player. And so the player is, of course, just ourselves. So we can just say get ref to self and pass that in for the player. All right, so now, one last thing we need to do. So now that we've called on interacted, we need to break out of this loop. So that way we don't interact with multiple things at once. So we want to actually just take this and then drag it back around and hook it up to the break. And I'm just going to double click to create some reroute nodes just so you can kind of see what's going on better. And you can move these with the arrow keys. That's all I'm doing right now. Just using the arrow keys to move these around to make it a little neater. So you can see it does this for loop, and then when it finally finds one that implements this interface, it loops back around here and it breaks out of this, which stops the for loop. All right, so now when we run this and we get close to the box, it should call this function and print out interacted with pushable object. All right, so now if we go here, see at the top left, it says interacted with pushable object. And if we're far away from it, or we're next to something else that isn't pushable, then it doesn't print it, right? Okay, so this is the first step. This is a very generic step. It's just basically groundwork that we need to do in order to get interaction working for anything in our game. Doesn't really matter if it's pushing objects or not. So in part 2, we'll start working on the actual pushing code. So I'll see you guys in part 2.